So, like Tron was saying, my name's Maddie or Madeline. And I wanted to kind of start off this class with a Chinese proverb because what better way to set the tone? So, I think this is a really cute little quote. It's the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. So, you guys are in the right place at the right time. Alrighty. So in this class, we're going to break down kind of everything that you need to know about caring for a tree in Utah. We're going to talk through why you would want trees in your landscape, how to plan for trees if you're considering adding trees to your landscape, or how to look at your existing trees and see if you would like to keep them in your landscape. And then there's a lot of tree planting that is kind of like, there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So we're going to talk about the best way to plant a tree, how to water your tree, mulch your tree, maintain that tree. And then we'll go into how to choose a tree for your landscape as well. And then at the very end, I'll talk about if you live in Jordan Valley service area or a couple of other service areas throughout Salt Lake or Utah, there is a tree bait available. So I'll talk through how to see if you're eligible for that too. So let's first talk about the benefits of trees. Trees have so many benefits to us. I mean, this isn't new news. I feel like everybody kind of knows. But we love trees here because we're a water district and they're great water managers for us. So trees help us in a ton of different ways. They're really great at filtering out water. So as far as like a water quality standpoint goes, they're excellent at that. They also help us a lot because they do provide so much shade. And when we get that canopy cover, it helps us not have to irrigate what's under the canopy quite as much, like our perennials and things, because it keeps it cooler. So a lot of times this happens on like a small residential scale in your own yard where maybe your grass does or does not grow really well under your tree. And that's because it's kind of creating this microclimate. Obviously, it helps with biodiversity. Here we have, I think, a cedar waxwing. I'm not a great bird idea, but enjoying some berries. So birds, trees, bugs, everything like that. We love a tree for that. Privacy, the trees also really help with privacy, especially in like our newer subdivisions. When you go into like a newly developed area, you can see that they've planted a bunch of trees, but they're just still babies. And so you're like, wow, it feels really open in here, right? And sometimes our like human psychological self doesn't really love that. So planting a tree though in years to come can help you with privacy. They also help with wind breaks, which is another thing that we often don't think about, but in especially windy areas like South Jordan, Riverton, Bluffdale, those areas typically can get a little bit windier, and so trees can kind of help prevent some of that. Reduce air pollution, big thing in Salt Lake Valley, and then they can also help you save money on your energy bills if they're planted in the correct spot. So we call this passive solar, where basically if you plant a tree on like the south side of your house, south or west side of your house. And it's a deciduous tree. In the summer, all of its leaves are going to be there. And then when that time the afternoon sun comes and is really beating on your house with that bright, bright sunlight, your deciduous tree is going to kind of be blocking it. So you don't have to spend as much money on your air conditioning. And then in the winter, all of the leaves fall off and that sunlight can actually enter into your home and kind of heat it for you. So that's just, strategic planting, but they can help with that. And then there are also a ton of socioeconomic benefits of trees, where there's been tons of studies about, how walking through forested areas can help us feel less stressed and more restored. In Chicago, they did a study on how trees and neighborhoods lead to less crime. They also help to improve economic value of areas, and they help to cut down on noise pollution as well. So if you love trees just because you love to be around them, there's like studies to show that that's your biology. And if you just love trees because you want your house to look really fancy, then there's studies to like promote that as well. So now let's get into like, some of the nitty gritty of this all. So let's talk about planning. So this is before you begin a project. So what we really are asking you to do is kind of just go out into your yard and really just take a look at everything, take a look at everything that's existing and do what we call a site analysis. Now, this site analysis, it's really, really important if you're planning on doing a landscaping project or if you're planning on adding any new trees to your landscape. What you're going to be looking for, these are just some of the things, by the way, this isn't an all-encompassing list, but look for your existing trees. Do you have trees in your landscape that are already there? Look for areas where maybe you want to add a new tree. Maybe you have, like a nice gathering area and you'd like to have it be a little bit more shaded during the summer heat so you actually can go out and enjoy that area more frequently. Make sure to check if there are easements on your property. This is a really, really important thing, especially if you're going to be investing in a tree, because if you plant that tree in an area where there is an easement and that utility needs to come in, to do work on the easement for whatever reason, they will have to remove your tree, and no one wants that. It's just really sad. It's frustrating. So make sure to check if you have easements on your property. And then also look at your property's microclimates. So what that means is like, do you have an area where it's really weirdly marshy all the time? Or do you have an area where you're like, gosh, nothing grows here. It's just so hot. Like the sun just hits my vinyl fence and then it just scorches the earth right there. Like look at these things and kind of see like, okay, what are my landscape needs? And then how could a tree benefit that? One thing I do want to mention is that trees should be kept out of the lawn. So if you have an existing tree and it's in an area that is planted with lawn, maybe consider designing something else around that tree so that it's not lawn. Or if you're planning on planting a tree, try and figure out if there's a place you can keep it out of the lawn. And this is for a couple different reasons. One of the first reasons is just we irrigate our turf grass with overhead spray. And what happens is our turf grass, their roots are only, 2 to 4 inches deep most of the time. And a tree roots are like 3 to 5 feet deep. And so really you're just encouraging those tree roots to just stay shallow where the water is. And we'll get more into this a little later on in the presentation, but that's just not great for the long-term health of your tree. It's also a maintenance headache. You don't want to be weed whacking around the trunk of your tree and then you're hurting the trunk wood and then, you're exposing the tree to disease and things like that. And then this is a super, super, super important one. Please plan for the mature size of your tree. It's going to be tough, I won't lie, especially because you'll go to the nursery and you'll be looking at all the trees and you're like, oh my gosh, they're all babies. Like they're so little, I could put it anywhere, but that tree will grow, hopefully, if it's, planted correctly. It will grow, and then one day it will be very large and maybe it won't fit in the area you planted it in. So that's kind of what this image is talking about a little bit. This tree is maybe planted a little too closely to that secondary fence, just because once it's a mature tree, it could maybe lift the fence up. Some of the roots could kind of be bugging it, and things like that. So just plan for the mature size. Let's see. Now, if you have existing trees in your landscape, this is another part of that site analysis where maybe it's a good time to figure out, okay, what species are they? Are they something that I want to keep in my landscape? Are they healthy? And if you don't know, if you're like, okay, listen, I'm not a tree expert, and that's totally fine. We have resources for that. So I would really recommend contacting a local arborist through the ISA. They're amazing. They'll tell you, what species that tree is, if it's healthy, if it's not healthy, what you can do to kind of, help get it to be healthy, or if maybe it's time to remove that tree. And talking about removing mature trees, there's a lot of questions about like, when should I remove a mature tree? The common rule of thumb is if 50% or more of the branches are dead or damaged. At that point, it's kind of tough for the tree to rebound after that if 50% or more of it has been damaged. So that's kind of like a general rule. That's not to say that that's always the case, but that's just an example of how to kind of do this site analysis yourself. Another time to remove an existing tree is if there are structural issues with the tree, or if it's going to be causing you long-term maintenance headaches, like if you have a hollow trunk, or if your tree is leaning, or if you see that your tree is looking, kind of sickly and you're worried about branches falling onto your home. These are things that cost, thousands and thousands of dollars. So sometimes you're like, okay, is this worth my time and resources to keep this tree? And this is all, once again, coming from like, we're tree lovers here. We want to have as many trees as we possibly can in our landscapes, but we also want to, have properly planted and planned for trees in our landscapes so that, you're not dealing with these issues where you're having to invest tons of time and tons of resources into keeping a tree. I love this picture because this is a great example. I think this is a Colorado blue spruce. I'm not 100% for certain, but it sure looks like it. And these trees get massive. Like if this thing was to tip sideways, it's almost the size of the house. You know what I mean? So when this person purchased this tree, maybe it was just a little baby, maybe it was in a smaller pot. And aren't they so glad that they didn't put it right up against the foundation of their house? And we've seen this happen a ton of times. People will plant too close to their house and then they have structural issues with their foundation, or it starts to create a problem where there's a leak that's forming into their home. So we just don't want you to have to deal with any of that. Now, with your existing trees in your landscape, you have to be really careful with them during a construction project. So once you kind of know what the tree is, you've decided it's healthy and I want to keep it, consider how making a landscape change might affect the health of that mature tree. So some things to kind of think about and maybe trying to avoid is try and avoid soil compaction. And this happens super easily in a construction project, like by driving heavy equipment, by routinely walking in one particular path or area. You can see in this image, the soil has definitely been compacted. You can tell because it looks like concrete that has just been like crumbled up. And really, when you think about it, imagine being a little root having to try and push through that. Like you're going to have a bad time doing that for sure. So that's kind of the philosophy behind that. Um, Try also to avoid damaging roots during construction. Now, we know that some root damage, that's just life, that's kind of just like going through life as a person. Sometimes things happen that hurt your feelings. And the same thing is going to happen to your trees during a construction project. So it's not the end of the world, but just try and preserve, like, we aim for at least 75% of the root system being preserved. So let's say you're doing a turf removal project in a park strip, for example, and you have some trees that you want to keep in your park strip. Maybe consider not just like scraping the turf off all the way across, because what you could do is remember those trees have been planted in turf grass, so their roots have been trained to be really shallow and on the surface. And if you just scrape the top of those roots, the roots to a tree are kind of like the arteries of our heart. So, if you start cutting arteries, it's not a good look. So we want to try and avoid that. A rule of thumb that I kind of try and think about is like the bigger the root, probably the more important it is. So if you just at least try to avoid those bigger roots, that should at least help. You can kind of, you're just gonna have to cut through tree roots. It's a fact of life, but try and do the best you can. Sean, were there any questions on like the planning section you want me to go over, or have you got it?
Let's see. Um, I don't see any questions yet, but yeah, I just want to say I totally agree with what you're saying about protecting the tree roots.
Cool.
Yeah, and I would almost say that it may be better to spray glyphosate around the tree to kill the grass and then try to not dig out the grass in that area if you're removing lawn. Just let the lawn die around it. That's probably better for the tree than scraping grass and soil and then damaging roots trying to get the grass removed.
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I mean, especially like a lot of times, we want to do things like the organic way, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I love organic gardening. But sometimes here and there for like the long-term health of a tree, it's
Mhm.
almost better just to like bite the bullet, use the glyphosate, just use it wisely, right? Don't be crazy with it, but then just get rid of that lawn and then you don't have to worry about digging around the tree. So that's
Yeah,
a great tip.
yeah, protect those roots as much as you can. I don't see any questions. I think we're good.
Okay, well, if y'all think of anything, don't be shy. So now we'll kind of go into like the planting. This is where there's going to be controversy. This is where the drama begins. So buckle up, people. We're going to talk about how to prep, plant, and stake your trees for success. So, first things first, picking out a tree when you go to the nursery, picking out a smaller tree is often better than planting a tree with a larger caliper size. Now, what a caliper is, it's just like, it's a funny little tool that people use to measure tree trunks. Basically, it's how big the tree trunk is. So, a smaller width of a tree trunk is going to be better to plant than a wider width. And this is tough because when you go to the nursery, you're going to see these beautiful trees and you're like, wow, that looks so amazing and it's so big and it's going to grow so quick in my landscape and it's perfect. And they're way more expensive also. So the nursery is also like, yes, please buy this. But there's been studies showing that actually a smaller caliper sized tree will often catch up to like a larger ball. We call it balled and burlapped. That's like when the tree is so big it won't fit in a pot. And so they wrap the roots in like that burlap material. A smaller tree will catch up to the growth of that burlapped, balled and burlapped tree only in like a couple of years. And this is because trees, like people, when we're younger, we're more resilient. So it's also like saying the you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, whatever the saying is. Same thing goes for trees. So these trees in the nursery, they've been grown in like a spa, right? They have all the nutrients they could ever want. The light is perfect. They have, you know, an adequate amount of water. And then we chuck them out into Utah where it's hot and our soil is kind of crappy, and they just kind of go into like shock. They're like, oh my gosh, what? I'm not used to this. So if it's a smaller or younger tree, it often just has more opportunity to just get those younger roots exposed to our native soil faster, which then just help them be stronger and more resilient through time. They'll also go through less stress when planting. Once again, it's like trying to convince your grandpa to move out of the state and do something that is not a part of his lifestyle. Probably not going to happen, but you can move a baby really easily because they don't really care, right? It's kind of that same thing. And then this is a slide that kind of goes in more into detail about like removing grass around a tree. So when you are removing grass, like Sean and I were mentioning, do it so very carefully. If you want to use a non-selective herbicide, then that's like a glyphosate. Just remember that the glyphosate, whatever's on the package, is the law. So make sure you fully read that, and know that the glyphosate, it's virtually like biologically inactive once it hits our soil. So it has these strong binders in it so that it won't move through the soil systems. So if you're worrying about, you know, like sterilizing your soil or killing all the microbes in there, the glyphosate or whatever you want to use, um, they've like engineered it so that it hopefully won't do that. Um, you can also consider like mowing your grass down really short before you apply it. Also, if you want to leave the dead grass clippings, they'll serve as like a mulch and kind of add those nutrients back into the soil. Um, and then you can kind of like apply some bark mulch on top. Um, a lot of times other people will just like hand dig out around the roots, which that's another great option if you want to use like a weed knife or a dandelion digger or something and just kind of get those like nooks and crannies out. A lot of people are also turning to this sheet mulching method, which there's been, um, I'm not an expert in sheet mulching by any means, but there's been some like conflicting studies that come out. So I would just recommend looking into it yourself. A lot of times with trees specifically, people are worried about the cardboard limiting the oxygen cycles in the soil. So it's like water is not being able to travel down and through that sheet mulching area of cardboard. And so then it limits that oxygen level in the soil, which can be detrimental, but it's still, you know, a great option. I just don't know if we've seen it long term in use for long enough, but definitely just do your own research on that one. I have seen it be successful for people. I've also seen it not work for people. So, but those are just a few more options on removing grass. And then you're going to want to prep your root ball. So this is where people usually start to get so scared. And I understand because in this image, you see Sean just absolutely destroying the root ball. And you're like, wait a minute, Maddie, you were just saying like, hey, don't damage the roots. And now, girl, you literally taking like a chainsaw to those roots. And to that, I say, yes, we are. So this is actually good for the tree, which I know sounds crazy, but what you're going to want to do is take your tree, take it out of the container, whatever the container is. If it's a pot, take it out of the pot. We believe me, we've seen trees planted literally just in the full pot into the ground. I don't know what the thought process is, but take it out of the pot. Make sure if there's a cage on the tree, cut the cage off. You don't want any sort of like container on this tree, no burlap, nothing. So make it just dirt roots tree, right? And then a lot of times these trees have been buried so that their root flare is kind of covered up. Let's see, I think in the next slide, I kind of highlight what that root flare is. Yeah, so in this red circle here, you can see that's the root flare of the trunk. And I have another slide coming up soon that's like a better infographic to show you how you can kind of see that. But it's really important that you expose this root flare. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cut off the bottom of this root ball. And then you're going to want to cut off the sides of the root ball. So it should have started, most times trees come, they're kind of circular in a pot. You're going to want to make it into kind of like a cube. And this is because you want the roots to be moving away from the trunk like spokes on a wheel. So if there are any large, we call them circling roots, this is also true for perennials as well. When you take a perennial out of a pot or take a tree out of a pot, you can see like the root growth pattern kind of going around because the roots have had nowhere else to go. So they're just kind of growing in a circle. And they will continue to grow in that same circle forever and ever and ever and never really grow outward into our native soil. And then what happens is, one, your tree is more likely to be prone to dying in the future. Like it will literally strangle itself as those roots get bigger. But also, like the structure of your tree isn't there because it's just growing essentially in a pot in the ground again. So then it's really wobbly. So here is a picture that kind of talks a little bit about that root flare, right? So, when we were in kindergarten and we were learning how to draw trees and we drew like the horizon and then a trunk and then like the little fluffy hat, where we had that trunk kind of like flare out, that's the root flare. Sometimes it's called the trunk flare. I call it a true root flare. I don't know. But you know what it is. It's the kindergarten part where the trunk gets wider towards the bottom. Once you've cut up your root ball and you know what size it looks like now, because remember, you'll lose a ton of material. Like the tree will come, in a huge pot, and then you'll cut it kind of down and you'll lose a lot of that material. Then you want to dig your hole. Because if you dig your hole before you cut the root ball, it's going to be way too big once you've actually finished prepping your root ball. So then you want to dig your hole. And you want to make sure that it's as deep as the tree's root ball, but 2 to 3 times as wide. And what digging a little bit wider does is it just kind of helps to break up the soil a little bit so that these roots, they don't have to work as hard to push through like a tough clay soil or whatever. It's like already been a little bit broken up for them. And make sure to dig the hole after you've prepared the root ball, because once again, you're gonna take like digging a hole. It's not that hard, but it's also like not that fun. And so you don't want to spend like your whole day digging this massive hole and then be like, oh, I actually wasted like 4 hours. If it takes you 4 hours to dig a hole, I'm sorry, but yeah. Anyways, here are some really cool pictures. These photos are all from USU Extension. I kind of stole them from them. So thank you, USU Extension. But these are awesome pictures showing what I'm talking about when I'm talking about those circling roots. You can see, especially in this top left-hand corner, this was a tree that was never cut up, like the root ball had never been cut. And you can see those roots never stopped growing in that circular pattern, right? And obviously this tree is no longer alive because it is dead. So you can really see like that is not what you want. You don't want that to happen. You can see in some of these other pictures that the tree is starting to strangle itself. This is sometimes called a girdled root, where literally it's like the tree is slowly just like choking itself out because our roots are getting bigger and bigger as our tree's maturing, but they haven't learned to move away from the trunk, right? So they're just still getting bigger around the trunk, and it's like when you wear a turtleneck that's too tight and it's just like, oh my gosh. So it's kind of slowly strangling the tree. This is what we do want, right? So we can see here, these roots are looking like they're spokes on a wheel, right? They're going outward. That tree is going to be so much more stable than some of these trees, right? These trees are honestly, their lives are going to be cut short. This tree is like, he is planted, he is happy, he feels awesome. And if you went up and like wiggled that trunk, it would not be going anywhere. So does that kind of make sense, the whole cutting of the roots thing? I know that's kind of a controversial take, just because people can get really nervous when they have to, think about literally tearing apart their root ball. But I promise a little bit of tough love goes a long way in these types of situations. So another thing that is kind of a hot topic is prepping the soil. So once you've, prepped your root ball, you've dug your hole, then you're going to place your root ball into the hole, and you want to make sure that the root flare, the trunk flare, is level with that ground level. So you can see in this picture that trunk flare is just right up against where the native soil is. And then at Conservation Garden Park, we just believe in backfilling with native soil only. And this is because what can happen sometimes if you put in a bunch of soil amendments is what you're doing is you're ultimately just putting that tree into another pot of sorts. So it's once again, it's like being at the spa, right? If the roots only ever learn to grow in the nice, cushy spa area, they're going to end up just circling only where that soil is really, really nice. And we want to expose those roots to our really like dense Utah native soil as quickly as possible so that they can get more resilient throughout time. Um, so yeah, we don't really recommend backfilling. We just want just the native soil as much as you can, tough love at the beginning, healthier trees in the long term. And then you want to make sure that you compact the soil. So a lot of times we do this just by kind of like stomping on it. You know, once again, a little bit of tough love goes a long way. And this just kind of helps to remove any air pockets. You want the root and the soil to have direct contact, which is going to help your tree establish itself. And it's also going to help your tree have better access to water that's in the soil. And then another hot button issue, we like to say that you should remove all staking of your trees. A lot of times trees will come from the nursery with like some nursery stakes in the pot, and we want you to remove those. We say you should only stake a new tree if they can't stand upright on their own. So that happens, you know, that's it just is life, right? Sometimes a tree will kind of have like a weird growth pattern, and sometimes you might just need to pull it upright. But those trees should only really be staked for a 1 year maximum. And that's because, once again, I don't know if anyone here has seen The Revenant. It's like the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and he gets like attacked by a bear. But there's a quote in it, and I'm not going to get it totally right, but it's something about um, like the trees that have the strongest winds blown upon them like are more resilient or something. That was a terrible, that was terrible quoting there, but it's true. Like you want your tree to have to kind of work a little bit against some of our winds so that it can become stronger, right? Like all of these things are also great metaphors for life too. You know, you have to go through adversity to get yourself to be a little bit more strong. So same thing with a tree. This picture is crazy. I'm not even sure where this is. One of our horticulturists got this picture for me. And you can see this person has taken a stake of wood and then they have duct taped their tree to it like so much so that it can be perfectly straight and upright. And I'm just going to tell you right now, this tree is not gonna be happy for very long. I wouldn't be happy if I was duct taped to a pole. You know, you have to kind of make your trees become resilient themselves. So, okay, that's kind of the end of like the prepping section. Are there any questions on that section before I get into watering?
No, you're doing a great job. I don't see any questions, and I agree that last picture is pure like insanity. I don't
Isn't
understand.
that crazy? Like
I
I've
don't,
never seen something so crazy.
yeah, yeah.
Also,
The thing that I get worried about with staking trees and things like that is they just get left on too long.
yeah.
Way too long, especially in like commercial landscape situations, like in the parking lot of a business. I mean, you'll see tree stakes that have obviously been on the trees for like a decade.
Yeah.
And then the staking material is now bound up in the trunk of the tree and the branches of the trees. And yeah, like you
Ugh.
said, 1 year maximum. And plant the tree and see if it can actually handle being planted without a stake first.
Yeah.
Um, because yeah. Oh,
No.
I do see one question that's come through though.
Oh, yay.
We have a large tree in the park strip that has roots circling. This is a very old tree. Anything we can do to help it now?
Ooh, that's a good question. Is it like is it healthy? Is it doing okay so far? If it is healthy, I would say honestly, probably just leave it alone because,
Yeah.
and Sean, I would take your opinion on this too, but the roots that are, once again, those like the bigger the root, the more important the artery type of a thing. So at this point, I wouldn't risk it just because it's like you don't want to cut one of those main arteries, but
Yeah.
I don't
It's
know, Sean, what you think.
yeah, I agree. It is what it is at this point. Uh,
Yeah.
the best time to fix those situations is when the tree is planted. Once the tree has been in the ground for even longer than a year, there's not a whole lot you can do there. It just kind of is what it is, unfortunately. But if the tree's doing healthy, just enjoy it. And we'll probably still live a pretty decent life. But yeah, it just kind of is what it is at this point.
Yeah. And that's why, like, especially if you're hiring landscape contractors, a lot of times they're amazing, and then a lot of times they're just taught what's like the industry best practices are. And sometimes what can end up happening is they don't like, we show a very tough love type of way of putting your trees in the ground, right? And so that's to ensure that they're healthy long term. So, I would even say like it might be beneficial for you to just, if you are hiring landscapers, to just plant your own trees, because they might be too afraid to do like, this tough love type of attitude to them. So if you don't want your trees to end up, being planted incorrectly, because this isn't taught all of the time. This is like a new class even for us. So I worked actually with a lot of our local arborists and with the Utah Community Forest Council. They helped me prepare this class, and they were like, oh my gosh, I wish we had this information to present sooner. And I was like, I know, we just haven't talked about it yet. So yeah, I would say to avoid the girdling and everything, maybe just do some tough love yourself, or just tell your contractor that's how you'd like it to be planted.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend too, is just be very specific about how you want it done. So,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I think we're good to move forward.
Sweet. Okay, we'll go into the watering section. Now, I'm kind of like a cheeky, sarcastic person, so some of these like captions I just kind of made funny because I wanted to. But so I said, water your trees like your future depends on it, because it kind of does. So, um, now this is a little bit of a nerdy section, so if I put you to sleep, I'm sorry, come back in a couple minutes. But if you're a nerd like me, then get buckled up because this is so cool. So I want to talk a little bit about tree root anatomy. So our tree roots, they don't grow to seek water. I think a lot of times there's this misconception that like, oh, the roots are out there and they're like growing to try and find the water, right? And they're like semi like conscious and they can make these decisions to find water. And that's not really true. What happens instead is they just grow where the water is. So which I know sounds very similar, but basically what the difference is like if you have a tree planted in lawn and you irrigate with overhead spray, the roots will only grow where that overhead spray is putting the water, because that's where the water is. They're not going to attempt to even seek water down deeper at all, because they're not these conscious beings that are like, oh, let's see what else is down here, right? They're like, oh, the water's here, I'm going to grow here. So, um, the most important roots to water are the ones at the edge of the tree canopy. This is called the drip zone. So the roots that are closer into the trunk, a lot of times they're more mature roots, and the wood has actually become like, there's like a xylem and a phloem, and I forget the actual name of the type of woody material, but the roots closer to the tree trunk are more woody. So they're not actually absorbing that much water. They're more like structural parts of the tree now. The roots that are absorbing water are at the edge of that drip zone, um, or water zone root, whatever you want to call it. We call it a drip zone here. Um, I will say this drip zone will change as the tree matures and the canopy grows. So, however big your tree canopy is, the outside of it, like the whole circumference, that's where those water absorbing roots are. And then as its life goes on, its root zone will kind of get bigger. And typically on a mature tree, there aren't water absorbing roots within 2 feet of the trunk. That's just, once again, one of those like rough rules. That's not always the case. That's just, kind of a guesstimate there. So, some more little tree root anatomy. Tree roots, now I thought that like, we have some prairie grasses that have root systems that are like 10 feet deep, 16 feet deep, crazy. That in my head was how I thought trees were until I started to learn more about trees. Really, our tree roots only get down to be about 3 to 5 feet deep on a really deeply rooted tree. So tree roots are absorbing water at least 18 inches below the soil, and honestly, they really, like the water absorbing roots typically only go about 2 feet down. So that to me, just like it totally changed my concept of like, oh, deeply watering a tree, or like how deep these roots are. Um, I also want to say mature trees, there's often a common misconception that you don't need to water them because their roots go so deep and they're so established that they already can just get water from other places and they don't need any water. But that is a common misconception. Mature trees in Salt Lake Valley, especially, do require water. Because I like to say, imagine, you're here and there's no infrastructure. You're one of the first people to settle in Salt Lake Valley. You would look out and you would not see native trees anywhere except in riparian areas. You would see maybe some cottonwoods and some willows along what? Streams and creeks. Um, and that's because the mature trees, that's where they like to grow. That's our native environment, right? So if we are planting trees out here, they're not going to grow even when they are mature if we don't irrigate them. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about why watering trees like a lawn is a problem. And I think this picture does a great job of showing it. And this is something we see all the time, right? We see it in our parks, we see it maybe in our own yard, in our neighbor's yard. You can see how shallow these roots are, right? So our overhead spray sprinklers, they don't water deep enough to reach the tree roots, like that 2 feet deep roots. So what happens is we're training our roots to just stay in that 2 to 4 inches deep zone, right? And then also what's happening is your sprinkler, as it's spraying, it's just spraying into the trunk of your tree. And remember, your tree trunk, it's a different type of wood. So it's not absorbing any of that water. And really all you're doing is introducing that trunk to disease, because it's like having a sore on your arm or your leg or something. And if you keep that sore constantly wet, it's never going to heal, right? And so it's just going to kind of get worse and worse, and weird things are going to happen to you. So that's what happens to our trees when they're constantly being hit by overhead spray. And then another thing that we see happen is more of like an aesthetic thing, but trees with a larger trunk, they can also block some of the spray from hitting areas of your lawn or hitting areas of, like, maybe it's your planting bed or whatever, and it can cause dead spots because that trunk is just like taking the full force of your sprinkler and it's not getting sprayed out anywhere else. So what we recommend is, we say get those trees out of the lawn. We do not want them in the lawn. We recommend watering within an inline drip system. So we have a ton of different videos on like how to switch your overhead spray sprinklers to drip. So I'm not going to go too much in depth in this class about that. But if you are interested, I would highly recommend checking out our switch to drip class. It's on our YouTube channel. And we also might have one coming up soon too, Sean. I'm not sure, like in person. Um,
Yeah, we do. There's a I think it's next weekend maybe. I don't remember for sure, but yeah, it's coming up.
yeah, so go to that if you're interested. I'm just going to briefly cover it. So we say that our inline drip tubing, which inline drip, that's where the holes are in the line, the emitters are already built into the line. We say that the tubing should be installed in concentric rings or squares. You can make it a square too if you don't want to do the circle thing. And start at least a foot away from the trunk, because remember, our tree is going to mature, right? So if we have a baby tree, we don't want to put the drip right up next to that trunk because it's going to get bigger and bigger. And we've seen tree trunks actually like absorb almost drip tubing, and then the tree dies because it has like a chunk of plastic in its side, right? Like we don't want that. So set up your trees for success, um, and install your drip rings based off of the mature size of the tree. So this can also seem kind of counterintuitive because you're like, okay, but isn't that wasting water? Well, just maybe plant some other things around in that area, make it kind of like a planting bed, um, to kind of take up some of that water until your tree matures. And then the number of rings is going to just depend on how big that tree is going to get. So there's these types of root zones. There's a critical root zone and a total root zone. Make sure that you're really just covering that critical root zone. It should cover about 60 to 75%. I just like to say, however big your tree canopy is, put your drip there at least, and then a little beyond, and you should be totally okay. The tree species is going to determine your run time and your irrigation schedule. With watering with drip, our soil type is going to is going to help you determine what type of drip you purchase. So just do a quick soil test at home. We have a ton of videos on our Instagram about how to do that as well. And then you can go into Sprinkler Supply or just look it up, and kind of see like, okay, what type of emitter spacing should I get? Typically, we recommend that with a clay soil, you want your emitters to be farther apart. So we say like about 18-inch spacing, and sandy soil, you want your emitters to be closer together. So 12-inch spacing. And in Utah, predominantly in the valley, you're going to have clay soil, and then it's going to get sandier as you move up the bench. So that's just kind of a quick rule of thumb if you don't want to do a soil test. Here's a good example. You can see there's a mature tree kind of in like the back of this picture. This is a good example of how to set up inline drip. You can see the drip lines are spaced evenly, the lines are not right up against the trunk, and that whole root zone is covered, which is great. This is a bad example. You can see there is literally only one drip line, and this is being watered with point source drip. You can see there's kind of like some spaghetti tubes running off there, and it only has one or maybe two spaghetti tube lines. And this is just not enough water, and it's also only putting water in that certain area. So remember, the roots are only going to grow there because that's where the water is, rather than in the good example picture, the water is being distributed everywhere, so the roots are going to be encouraged to kind of grow outward and become more established that way.
Maddie,
Now, yeah.
on the picture in the parking lot, if you can go back to that again. The other reason you don't want it like this is, like Maddie said, the roots are going to grow where water is. But I've seen trees planted like this, watered like this, and then 4 or 5 years later, they fall over in a windstorm because the roots
Mhm.
have never moved out into the surrounding soil because the drip emitters are placed only on the root ball. So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, just big drawback to setting things up like this.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially like with the windstorm that happened in like 2020, you could really tell what trees were planted well and what weren't. So this is something we see all the time with point source is we'll put the emitters right up against the trunk. And remember, the wood of the trunk does not absorb water. That's like trying to eat a hamburger by like slamming it into your leg. Like it's just not gonna work. So do not put the emitters right up against the trunk like you see in this picture. Um, Honestly, we don't recommend using point source for watering a tree. I would rather you use inline drip, but if you do want to use point source, I would just say to install it as if it is inline drip. So kind of try and mimic that layout. And just use the emitters every 12 or 18 inches that way. And then establishment watering. A newly planted tree will need extra additional water on top of just that drip water. So it needs at least 2 years, sometimes longer, depending upon the species, to fully establish in your landscape. Directly after planting, give your tree 15 to 20 gallons of water, for every day for the next couple of days. And then you can also kind of create a ring of soil around the outer edge of the root ball to kind of hold more water in. It's kind of like a little like a berm that can kind of help keep that root ball wet. We recommend watering an establishing tree 1 to 2 times per week, just with a 5-gallon bucket. It's really important though that you check the soil around your new trees to see when you need to water. You can kind of put your fingers in there and feel if it's dry or if it's wet. And I also like to say, water, yes, that root ball, but also water the around it a little bit, because once again, we want to encourage those roots to like go where that water is, right? So if we just water right around the root ball, the roots aren't ever going to learn to go out into our native soil because the soil they were planted in that nice nursery soil is a lot comfier than our native soil. And then also a tip is to make sure you water throughout the winter as well, especially if you're planting an evergreen tree and it's a dry winter. A lot of times they need a little extra moisture. And then if you have established trees in your landscape, once again, don't water too close to the trunk. Water should be directed to the drip zone, and then bigger trees will need more water. So that's kind of the watering section. The mulching section is a pretty quick one, so I'll just kind of get into it real quick. This is my little cheeky caption of don't be shady, mulch your tree, baby. So mulch is awesome. It's going to serve as basically a protective barrier for your tree roots. And wow, what a beautiful drip setup for this tree, right? That's gorgeous. Um, it's going to discourage weeds from growing. It's going to help shield your roots from extreme temperatures. So in the summer, help keep those roots cool. In the winter, help insulate it. It also helps with moisture retention, and it can help prevent erosion around your trees. Now, with that being said, there are some mulches to avoid. There have been some studies that have come out that have said that dyed wood mulches, sometimes the dyes can affect your soil health. And then rubber mulch, I would say super avoid unless you're putting it in like an activity zone or a play area, just because it doesn't provide any of those beneficial nutrients to your soil. It also can be highly, highly flammable. So especially if you live, up on the side of the mountain in an area like Suncrest, you do not want to use this. Firewise landscaping, we don't want to put anything that's highly flammable near our homes or especially near our trees. And they also can be carcinogenic. So I would say just avoid rubber mulch unless it's in like a play area or somewhere where it makes more sense. With your mulch, you want to keep your mulch about 2 to 3 inches away from the actual trunk of the tree. Mulch against the trunk of the tree can retain moisture against that cambium layer. That's the name of it, cambium. That's like that woody, layer that doesn't like to suck up water. So the cambium layer, it cannot tolerate constant moisture, and it can kind of help to encourage rot if you keep moisture always right up against that cambium. So keep mulch 2 to 3 inches away from the tree. You don't want to put it also too close to the trunk because it can kind of like choke out the tree. We say the best practice is to use wood bark mulch or arborist wood chips or like a compost wood chip, and do that in about 3 to 4 inches deep everywhere around it. Weed barrier fabric, this is my number one mortal enemy. I hate weed barrier fabric. What happens with weed fabric is it works fine for year 1 or 2, and then eventually dirt is going to blow in from somewhere else, and weed seeds can grow literally anywhere. So they're just going to start to grow, their roots are going to get into the fabric, and then you're going to try and pull the weed, and it's really hard to get it out because it has been grown into this fabric. So weed fabric also increases runoff. It's going to increase your maintenance. It increases compaction as well. Like the soil cannot cycle itself as easily because you're keeping basically all of the air out of the soil. So it's bad for your trees, because remember, we don't want to compact our soil around our trees. It reduces the oxygen cycling. It reduces organic matter because no creepy crawlies are, cycling things. It also helps to increase the temperature, and it's just a short lifespan of a product that is really expensive. So just skip this and just do a thick layer of mulch instead. I promise you, you will not regret it. You will regret it if you use weed barrier fabric though. All right, maintenance. Now, we know no one wants to do maintenance, but you have to because we said so, and also just because it's a part of life. So we want to set you up for success with your tree maintenance here. So with pruning, and this is for non-fruit trees, I just want to preface that this is not for a fruit tree. You shouldn't do any major pruning on a tree in its first 3 years. And that's because anytime you prune a tree, you're sending signals to the tree that, oh, okay, I need to send some of my energy back to like growing or helping heal that newly cut area, right? And we want to be sending all of our trees' energy into getting those roots established. So just kind of leave it alone for the first couple years. Once it's, kind of established, we say to remove any dead, diseased, and quote unquote dumb branches. So that's like a competing branch. USU Extension has a ton of fantastic resources on this. So in this image that I got this from them, you can see we have some branches that are like crossing over. That's what we would call the quote dumb branch. If we have some broken branches, you can just kind of remove that off as well. So I'm not going to go too much into how to properly prune a tree. We do have like a full-time recorded class just on fruit tree pruning, and it's similar enough to pruning a non-fruit tree. But if you do have a fruit tree, you want to make sure you're doing a lot more cuts. So you want fewer branches because we want to be sending all that energy to those few branches to get big fruit. I will say every fruit tree has like a different philosophy and a different type of pruning. So I would just recommend checking out USU Extension for more resources on that. I don't really have time in this class to get into every fruit tree. So like I said, we have a full length fruit tree pruning class though that's on our YouTube channel. Winter maintenance, you want to make sure to protect the trunk for the first few years with a tree wrap. This tree wrap is just going to kind of help prevent the trunk from getting sunburned in the winter. A lot of times people use this also in like orchard settings as well. And then you want to cage your tree throughout the winter if you have And if you live in an area where there's deer, because sometimes the deer, they get a lot of like aggression in the winter and they're like mating season, they'll come and they'll like rub on trunks of trees and stuff. And then if it's a newly planted tree, sometimes they can just snap a tree in half. So you want to just cage it to kind of keep the deer out. If you don't live in an area where there are deer, you're probably okay skipping the cage. Weeding, just you want to remove all those suckers. You can see here that green kind of branchy looking thing, that's a tree sucker. Remove those. That's just the tree kind of sending extra energy into places we don't need it to. And then you just want to use a small hand tool or even just your hands themselves to just kind of pluck some weeds out around the tree. These are what's called a water sprout. So you can see they're kind of just like these things going straight up. You want to remove those as well. Now, talking about picking a tree, I didn't want to go through and say these are the trees you should pick in a landscape because there are tons of amazing tree options. So I'll show you a tool you can use to kind of help find out what tree is perfect for you. Rather, I wanted to go into what trees you maybe should avoid planting instead. So the first category is a weedy and invasive category. So these are trees like Siberian elm, which has weak wood, it's prone to disease, it's super invasive. This thing can grow out of like asphalt in the middle of a parking lot, I swear. So avoid planting that. Tree of heaven, another invasive species. It crowds out our native species and it secretes a chemical into the soil actually that is toxic to surrounding plants, which is not awesome. Salt cedar, sometimes these are called tamarisk plants. It just rapidly consumes water and it pushes out all of our native riparian species. It also secretes salt, so it increases our soil salinity so that other species can't live there. And then Russian olive. Now, I don't think you guys are going to plant any of these. I'm just saying if you do have any of these species in your landscape, maybe consider removing them. These ones I don't recommend just because they are really water intensive. They're also massive trees. So both of them we do have native species of these in Utah. So cottonwoods and willows. They're both native to riparian zones though. So that means they do require a ton of water and often soggy soil conditions. And sometimes our cottonwoods can get over 100 feet tall, and some species of willows can consume up to 100 gallons of water per day. So just long term in your landscape, these just aren't great. These are great trees, do not get me wrong, but they're just not great landscape trees. And then a couple that are just disease prone or prone to pests. Ash species, they're affected by the emerald ash borer, which it hasn't been found in Utah yet, but it's been found in Colorado and it kind of started, out east and it's been slowly moving its way west. So I would just say to be cautious, avoid planting ash, which is sad, but I just, and then purple robe locust, it's affected by locust borers. It can develop leaf spots and cankers and root suckers really easily. And then the flowering pear, it grows really quickly, but that means it has kind of weak wood. So sometimes it can't hold up to some of the wind in certain areas. And then this one, I know it's our state tree, so it hurts to say, but I would avoid planting aspens in a landscape. Once again, these are beautiful trees. I just don't believe that they're beautiful landscape trees. They are aspen trees. First of all, they like to be at higher elevations. So planting them in the valley leads to their aggressive root system. It will send up shoots throughout your entire yard. And then you're kind of like trying to mow over these aspen shoots. And aspens are all connected, like it's one organism, but a ton of different trees basically. So it will just continue to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And then you're just gonna have a maintenance nightmare. Once again, these are beautiful trees. They're just not meant to be down in the valley, and they're also just not meant to be in a landscape setting. Now, if you are looking for a great tree option, a great tree recommendation, I would say check out our plant database on conservationgardenpark.org. Here, what you'll do is you'll go into the plant database, and one of the filters is like, what are you looking for? And you can hit, deciduous tree or evergreen tree, and then it'll pull up everything we recommend in Utah with all of their mature sizes next to it, as well as like how to maintain that tree and any other information you might need to know. I would say look at your landscape and then find a tree that fits an area in your landscape rather than falling in love with a tree and then trying to force it to fit into your yard. There are tons and tons and tons of beautiful tree options. That's why I don't want to recommend any because I don't want to have like a monoculture of just one type of tree just for like, resiliency's sake, if we all planted ash trees and then the emerald ash borer came through, we wouldn't have any trees left. So it's important that we have a diverse ecosystem and a diverse urban environment so that we can, be resilient if to pests and diseases and things. And then my last little section, this is just one slide. It's about our tree bait. Money doesn't always grow on trees, but with us it does. So to know whether or not you qualify, just go onto utahwatersavers.com, put in your address. It will tell you everything that you qualify for. If you do live in Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District service area, we do have a tree bait. It's $50 per tree, up to 10 trees. You do have to be participating in our landscape incentive program. So you have to be planting a tree in an area where you've either removed lawn or switched a planting bed from overhead spray to drip. And then you just need to save your tree tag. That's what we'll collect upon your visit, just to ensure that you've actually planted a tree.
We moved into a house and a tree is fairly close to the house. Is
Mm.
there a best time to transplant slash plant a tree and move it away from the house?
It's a good question. I would say it depends on the maturity of the tree, right? If it's a very mature tree, transplanting's probably not an option, unfortunately. It's probably just a case of, having that tree removed. If it is not a mature tree, if it's been planted in like the last year, I recommend like the fall, early fall or late spring. Um, I don't know, Sean, what you think, but
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there it is like theoretically possible to move a mature tree, but it's a lot of money and usually not worth it.
yeah,
So,
I feel like I've never seen it be, and this is just once again, this is just personal Maddie anecdote. I've never seen it be successful. So,
yeah,
like long-term successful. I've seen it live for like a year or two after, but then it ultimately, it's just too much stress, right? It's like forcing your grandpa to move, right? It's just too much stress on the poor guy. So
yep.
you just,
Uh,
so
yeah, and then with trees, if you're planting new trees, I'd keep them away from the foundation. I wouldn't get any closer than 7, 8 feet from the foundation. I wouldn't go much closer than that.
yeah, I totally agree. And it might feel weird when you're planting it because you're like, well, this is a baby, and it looks like there's a bunch of dead space here. It looks weird, but like I said, just fill it in with some perennials for now. And ultimately, when that tree matures, you're going to be way happy you kept it away from the foundation.